Avatar: The Last Airbender's finale is the flagship of an already incredible show, but what made its ending so satisfying? Avatar was a staple of my childhood, so when I rewatched it as an adult and got to the finale, I remember being surprised at how many memorable moments from this show hadn't happened yet. And you probably already have immediate examples that jump out to you of iconic moments in Avatar's finale, but the more I looked into this, the more I was surprised at all the things I hadn't noticed despite having rewatched Avatar multiple times. My name is Pei, and today we're talking about when everything comes together. If you look closely at the foundation of many different aspects of what made Avatar so special, I think you'd consistently find great characters. And while Avatar had great music, amazing world building, remarkable animation, and jaw-dropping fight scenes, I do think that its characters stand at the forefront of what makes it so special. Because years after it ended, people are still talking about Avatar. Hell, I'm making a YouTube video about its finale 15 years after it aired. And the reason I believe that is because for anyone that's watched Avatar, it's not uncommon for a character from the show to stand out as one of their all-time favorites. Zuko and Iroh are obvious ones, but Aang, Katara, Sokka, and Toph are all incredibly strong. That's ignoring side characters that get less screen time who are also great, because Avatar showcased an incredible depth when it came to quality characters. So what I want to talk about today that I really think makes Avatar's finale special is how successfully the show resolved every character's arc. But before I jump in, I want to talk about this concept that I learned from one of the most influential fantasy writers in the modern era, Brandon Sanderson. Essentially, it touches on the promises a writer makes throughout a story. I'm going to refer to this term as bracketed ideas. First, you open the bracket with some sort of promise. For example, the Avatar has to save the world. And then eventually you close the bracket by delivering that promise. Like I've said in previous videos, I believe one of the core concepts of good writing is proper setup. And while the premise of bracketing may seem a little bit too predetermined, there's that famous quote, "surprising yet inevitable." A good example of application of this bracketing system is character arcs. And while the most common examples that we've pointed to so far are the beginning and end of a story, you can also break it up into smaller bracketed ideas. Each episode and season in Avatar has their own brackets. We also see character arcs, relationships in the plot having their own promises be fulfilled and closed, whether or not it's across individual episodes, seasons, or the entire series. So you could kind of represent an entire character's arc with bigger and smaller brackets. So what often determines whether or not a show or story's ending is satisfying is how well they deliver on those promises, while also avoiding making them feel predictable, cliche, and uninteresting. No one was shocked to find out that Aang wins in the end, but the journey in which he discovers his solution is incredibly interesting, inevitable, yet still surprising. So what promise do the writers make about Aang? What storyline and growth is inevitable for this character? Or more specifically, what's his arc? Much like the morals of a story can be debated, I don't think there's an objective answer here. I think there are just ideas that are well supported. If I had to simplify Aang's arc into one specific word, it'd be responsibility. Both responsibility as the Avatar, but also to himself. The start of his story revolves around running away. He gets stuck in the iceberg for 100 years because he couldn't grapple with the responsibility of being the Avatar, the predetermined nature of what his life was supposed to be. Other children started treating him differently, adults held him to a higher standard, and he had no choice in it. I think the simpler explanation for Aang's character arc would be him learning to take on the responsibility of being the Avatar, but I think there's another layer to it. If we look at the fulfillment of Aang's character arc, I think there's complexity that isn't just about accepting his role, because while taking on the responsibility to take care of the world as the Avatar is part of his story, I also think taking care of himself is as important. There's this philosophy I really subscribe to that before you can help others, you need to help yourself. Because to have a sustainable impact on the world, you can't consistently sacrifice different parts of your life. I believe Aang's arc isn't just about saving the world, it's about saving the world without compromising on what he thinks is morally right. In some ways, there's no absolute answer or line when it comes to the concept of the ends justify the means. Constantly humans trying to do the right thing compromise on immediate impact of an action for long-term effect. But if we look at a lot of villains in fiction or even human history where people committed horrendous acts consistently, it's often built off of a foundation of the ends justify the means, that they're doing something to create a better world. Because this idea, especially tied with power, often helps people justify bad actions in a way that still feels moral to them. So I'm a huge advocate of Aang's philosophy, and I think it's an incredibly satisfying solution when he finds his own approach to ending the conflict with Ozai without having to purposely take his life. Surprising, yet inevitable. Another obvious example of an incredibly satisfying ending in Avatar's finale is Zuko's character arc. Choosing one word to describe Zuko's journey obviously ends up back at honor. In the beginning of the story, he thinks honor is redemption in the eyes of his father and sister, and more specifically the Fire Nation. And throughout Zuko's story, we see individual arcs and episodes or season finales that demonstrate that he slowly learns that honor isn't about redemption in the eyes of his family, but more specifically, fighting for what is right, fearlessly with compassion and resolve. There's been a huge influx of discussion surrounding Stoicism, and it's actually been co-opted by a couple pretty crappy people. But I think if you find a healthier version of what Stoicism can represent, it would look a lot like Zuko's arc. Not emotional suppression or this idealization of what it means to be a man, but kind and compassionate honor. And this all comes to a head when he faces his trauma and history head on in his fight versus Azula. There's a deep-rooted self-consciousness in Zuko's arc, trying to prove that he's worthy of his position. And it's built off of this long-running history of playing second fiddle to his younger sister. He desperately wants the power she has, but it won't come to him easily. Instead, it's built over a long foundation of hard work, education, and an amazing mentor. In Season 2's finale, he wasn't ready to let go of his idealized perspective on regaining his honor. But in achieving it, being accepted by the Fire Nation and his family, even heralded as a hero, there's a remarkable emptiness to it, because even though his action hadn't reflected it yet, he started to understand what honor really meant. And the cool-headed strength he showcases in his fight against Azula, built off of the foundation of knowledge from all nations. It's beautiful, and he wins, but that's not the peak of his arc. Because choosing to sacrifice himself to save Katara is the epitome of everything he's learned across the entire series. Despite the assumption that Zuko's redemption would come in battle, it actually came in sacrifice. And because their finales are paired together, this leads nicely into Katara's arc, forgiveness. Katara is a moral figure throughout the entire series, consistently trying to stand up for what's right, fighting for the little guys even in situations where it doesn't make sense. However, her hate for the Fire Nation because of what was done to her mother blinds that sense of morality. But her biggest moment as a character doesn't come in the finale. It's in the choice to forgive the soldier who killed her mother, not a deeply violent action that represents a sense of justice, because it feels in line with Katara's character to fight against things like revenge cycles. However, I still think that Avatar's finale does properly encapsulate that growth. The decision to pair Katara and Zuko in the finale is a testament to that. Initially, she's incredibly resistant to Zuko joining the gang, and she's the slowest to come around, especially after she felt like her trust had been breached at the end of Season 2. But in fighting together against Azula, trusting him, and taking a step back, Katara demonstrates her growth, the fact that she doesn't need to insert herself into every conflict. She trusts Zuko, even shedding tears when he sacrifices himself to save her, because she was able to forgive. But have you ever heard that quote that forgiveness is for your own sake as much as theirs? Because who Katara is in the finale is a strong, capable person that she demonstrated herself to be throughout the series, but also someone that's incredibly forgiving. Toph is initially introduced as an incredibly powerful earthbender, one with a large ego and skills to back it up. But in that introduction, we're also showcased that she's very lonely, isolated in the world around her, her true self never being accepted by those closest to her. And while that ego supports her remarkable prowess as an earthbender, it's also a defense mechanism, a wall between her and the surrounding world. Initially in the series, Toph is incredibly distrusting, constantly threatening to bail on the group, but I think that's largely in part a way to protect herself from being vulnerable from people leaving her. But everything about her place in the finale is built around a foundation of trust, a deep-seated connection between her and the gang. Could you imagine anything more terrifying than blindly jumping off of a cliff, literally giving up your apparatus to see the world around you, and then landing and fighting in an environment where the only material for you to bend is metal? Because by the end of the series, Toph had a significant transformation from who she was introduced as, without losing sight of the things that made her such a special character. She is a badass, through and through, but seeing the vulnerability that came along with that strength was very special. The final arc I want to talk about today is Sokka's. Part of the reason I left him for last is because I think he has one of the more beautiful arcs in Avatar, one that's often underappreciated by the public, but more specifically, underappreciated by me. I think Sokka as a character is someone that I never really understood, but when I decided I wanted to do this video and I started doing some research on each character arc, Sokka's really stood out to me. There's a good argument to be made that Sokka's arc is about leadership, but I think his story has more to do with ego. letting go of the ideas that are so important to him, his idealized perspective of what it takes to be a hero. All of his ambitions and dreams as a kid ultimately revolved around protecting people. Because wanting to be a warrior as a non-bender in a bending world puts you at an inherent disadvantage. But throughout the story, Sokka learns to embrace his circumstance, at first through very humbling experiences that clearly challenge his ego, like losing to Suki on Kyoshi Island, and instead of digging his heels in, realizing he was wrong and that Suki's someone he could learn from, taking responsibility for his actions and apologizing. Because ultimately Sokka wanted to protect people, which I think led to this ego because the people he saw saving others were heroes, and he wanted to be just like them. But when we get that episode dedicated to him learning how to fight with a sword properly, Sokka learns to embrace his circumstance in a fight, focusing on what's within his control rather than fixating on his ideals. There are multiple examples of this, like his fight with Zuko against Azula in the Boiling Rock. Because even though I didn't connect with Sokka in the same way I did other characters when I was a kid, I knew how meaningful it was for him to throw his boomerang and sword away to save Toph, even if just to give them a couple more seconds. It's a strong metaphor representing his entire arc, letting go of periphery ideals to do what he ultimately holds most important, protecting the people around him. Because what made Avatar's finale so special isn't just one of these stories, but the way they were all set up beautifully before coming together. A collection of brackets, closing all at once.